In this episode of the Digital Trailblazer podcast, we're going to talk about how to price your offer for maximum profitability. So stay tuned.
If you want to build a legitimate, profitable online business without shiny objects, without the hypey gimmicks, and without the stress and overwhelm, if you want to make more money without having to be present online all day, every day, pumping out content that nobody sees and hustling DMs to generate leads and sales, then this is the place for you. Welcome to the Digital Trailblazer podcast, your online business university, where you'll learn how ordinary people start from ground zero with no influence, no email list or audience to sell to, and no business or marketing experience, and go from working 9-to-5 jobs to building successful 6- and 7-figure online businesses and all the steps in between. Learn the strategies that worked and what didn't. Learn the mistakes that they made and how to avoid them, and then learn their plans for scaling their businesses and taking things to the next level. All so that you can build your business faster and easier and make more money without sacrificing the things that are important to you in your life. I'm your host, Leah Ray Getz, and with me is my husband, Todd. Now, let's get to it with today's guest.
Welcome, everybody. I am Todd Getz, your host of the Digital Trailblazer podcast. And with me today is Marcel Petitpas. Hopefully I pronounced that right. It's a French thing, and I don't speak French. So Marcel, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience? Tell them what you're all about.
Thanks so much for having me, Todd. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Marcel. As you mentioned, one of the things I like to talk about is pricing, but really more broadly, I run a company called Parakeeto, and we specialize in helping service-based businesses, mostly creative and digital agencies, measure and improve their profitability and really solve that problem that doesn't really have a name. We call it profit management, which is the job that somebody in every agency is doing today, whether they want to or whether they know they're doing it or not. And it's sort of bringing the context from finance, operations and delivery, and sales together to answer the questions that they're trying to answer every day to run the business. Like, are we making money on our clients and projects? Are we charging enough? Is our team busy enough? How utilized are we going to be? Do we need to hire people if we do or don't close this deal? Those kind of day-to-day questions, we specialize in helping people get the answers to them so they can make better decisions and make more money.
And the thing is with pricing, this is one of those things that I find people are just all over the map with, especially when they're brand new and they're trying to put their offer together for the first time, or even if they've been trying to sell it for a while. We have some people on one end that think that just pricing it super low is going to be the way to go and they can make it up with volume. And if it's cheap enough people will buy and they'll be profitable. Then I see people on the other end where they saw some guru who's charging $10,000 or $20,000 for their program. And so they think that they can come in brand new and charge the same amount right away and people are going to buy. So help us figure out when we're pricing our offer, what are the big things we need to consider when figuring out what we're going to charge?
So there's sort of two sides to this conversation, and where we spend most of our time is on the sort of objective side of this. But I would define these two sides as the strategic side and the objective side. So on the strategic side, you sort of mentioned the general sort of two ends of the spectrum. And of course, there's infinite amounts of gray in between those two things, which is, am I going to be a cost competitive provider and I'm going to focus on selling things at a low price, trying to do high volume while I'll have tighter margins? Generally, I'll be able to make that up with volume. And that's my business strategy. And that's a very legitimate business strategy. Companies like Costco and Walmart and Amazon have done extremely well with this. Companies like Design Pickle, for example, if we're thinking about digital services, have done really well with this. You see this kind of strategy play out, and it is possible to be good at that. But it is a very different skill set than the other side of the spectrum, which is I'm going to be in a very small, specific category. I'm going to be an expert. I'm going to be seen as an industry leader. I'm going to have far less volume, but I'm going to charge higher prices, have far higher margins. And that's how I'm going to run the business. And I'm not here to tell people that, one of those is better than the other. That's not, I don't have a dog in that race, so to speak. But certainly the overwhelming majority of, I'll call them influences in our industry, would argue that having a higher price, being an expert is the better way to go. And I would concede that I think for most people, that's probably going to be more aligned to their skill set, and it's probably going to be more aligned to the kind of business they want to run and the kind of lifestyle that they want to have around that business. Generally speaking, you're not going to end up with as big of a business, and you don't have to be a really, really, really strong operator with a very keen eye on unit economics in order to run that sort of high margin business. Whereas if you're going to play the volume tight margins game, that is a business model that really rewards a strong operator and somebody that has really, really good financial and operations acumen, because ultimately what you're placing a bet on there is that you can out compete everyone else in the market on efficiency. Or in some cases, you might have an economies of scale that you have the funding or the cash flow to be able to accomplish that other people do not. So that's, from the strategic side, sort of how to broadly think about that.
Where does the ability to generate traffic play into this? Because I know that's one of the big things when we're looking at a new client that's coming to us to ask for help. That's one of the big things we take into consideration when they're looking to get profitable as fast as possible. We're looking at, okay, do you have an existing audience? What's your ability to generate traffic? Because if they come in with nothing, they've got no email list, they've got no social media presence, they got nothing going on, and they got a low ticket course or like a $50 offer. It's like those are two things that I would say you're starting from a very tough point, right? Because in order to get profitable with something that's $50 and you want to build a full-time income from that, well, you need a lot of traffic versus if you're selling something for $2,000 or $3,000 and you just need 3 or 4 sales to get to a $10,000 income a month. Well, that's a lot easier with a small amount of traffic.
Yes. And I think go-to-market strategy more broadly is a big consideration when you're thinking about this. So again, this is a generalization, but oftentimes when you think about that commoditization, sort of efficiency-based, low-margin business model, you're generally going to see that play out in markets that are fairly mature and where there's a lot of existing competition. And the reason for that is you're tapping into existing demand, right? So this is part of the reason that, what's a good example of this? Bottled water. You have premium priced bottled water and you have very, very low priced bottled water. You have a lot of people in the middle. But like generally speaking, if you were to do like a plot chart of this industry, the vast majority of water would all be kind of down in within $1 or $2 of each other in terms of on a per bottle basis. So that's a highly commoditized, highly competitive market. Now, the good news is millions and millions and millions and millions of people every single day are buying water. And so if you can basically get distribution where that attention and search is already happening, then the idea there is that you can basically quickly start to generate traffic because that traffic already exists. You're just trying to siphon some of it off. Now, of course, if you're doing PPC to do that, it's going to cost some money. If you're doing SEO, that may cost you money. It may not. Depends on if you have the skill set to tap into that. You might have some kind of ability to do PR and get earned media coverage in order to do that kind of thing. So go to market, I think, plays an important role. But what we're starting to touch on here is the magic of gross margin. And why I believe that that is the lifeblood of, at a fundamental level, it's the lifeblood of every good business. And it is the most important consideration for any pricing model, and starts to kind of veer us into the objective side of this, which is like whether you want to be a high priced or a low price competitor, you have to pay attention to gross margin, and you have to take into account how much gross margin is needed to fund your go-to-market and to fund your overhead and the rest of your business model, and actually have unit economics that are sustainable. And I find that that is the most overlooked part of pricing. Most people that I speak to don't even know what their gross margin is when they're selling something, especially a service-based business.
So let's dive into that, because when you say gross margin, there's a lot of things that are kind of tumbling around in my mind about what that could mean. What does that really mean for someone who's doing an online business, whether it's an agency or a coaching program or whatever?
Yes, you've raised the first issue with this conversation, which is you ask 10 different people what gross margin is in a service-based business, you'll probably get 10 different answers. And so that's the first issue that's sort of confusing. And so this is part of the reason that we've developed our own set of language at Parakeeto. We call this direct delivery margin and delivery margin. And the big reason for that is I'm so sick of arguing with accountants over semantic issues that aren't actually important. They want to define gross margin as being something else, all the power to them. But here's what I think is important. And this is generally important in every business model. There's a bunch of different language that you might be able to use to describe this. The first thing that I want to be clear on is what is the profitability of a unit that I sell? So if I'm in a product business, like a CPG business, maybe I sell chocolate bars. It's like when I sell a chocolate bar, what is my margin on that chocolate bar? Ignoring things like how many chocolate bars I produced this month, therefore how much utilization did I have in my manufacturing capacity, and ignoring what did I spend on overhead this month, right? Those are things that are fluctuating completely independent of the sale of one unique chocolate bar. And so I think one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is the only way that they think about profitability is bottom line profitability. And they try to apply that to every layer of abstraction in terms of how they look at their business. But what that starts to do is create a difficulty in answering very important questions. So like, if the profitability of my chocolate bar is changing every month because I produced more or less chocolate bars that month, or because I spent more or less on my overhead that month, then that's creating a false positive. It's telling me that my margins on the chocolate bar are changing, when in reality, they probably aren't. The margin on that chocolate bar is probably staying true. There are other things in the business that are changing, but those things are not inherently related. So that's the first thing we want to understand is when I sell a chocolate bar, or in a case of a service business, it could be a website or an SEO retainer or a consulting engagement, or I sell a course, or I enroll somebody into my group coaching program. What is my margin on that thing that I've just sold when I consider what I get paid for it relative to what it costs me to deliver on that thing, and only what it costs me to deliver on that thing? And generally speaking, across most industries, you want to have at least a 50% contribution or direct margin on that unit. And in some business models, you can be talking about 90, 95% type margins. If you're talking software, if you're talking education products, information products, or highly leveraged group coaching programs, there's a reason that those industries are so attractive. It's because they generally have extremely high direct margins on those products. But of course, the flip side of that is you're generally also spending a lot more money to acquire a customer because they're highly competitive markets, right? So there's a reason that you sort of need those kinds of margins. But that's the general thought. And if you sell a service, agency services, creative services, digital marketing services, et cetera, generally the floor is you want to have at least a 70% direct margin on a thing. So if you sell a website for 10 grand, you essentially want to get that website done for less than $3,000 worth of labor costs internally. And a lot of people listening to this are probably thinking like, oh, that's a lot more than the margin that I have right now. And we could talk a little bit more about why you need that much margin when you sell something, but that is the general floor based on the hundreds of firms that we've audited in our practice over the last 6 years.
So when I'm trying to figure this out, things like software subscriptions, do I consider that in that calculation? For example, my website costs, or my cost for my funnel, or my email marketing services, do those factor into that or not?
It depends. It's a good question. There are direct costs and there are indirect delivery costs. So if you think about, let's say I run an agency and I build websites, and I have sort of two different kinds of software subscriptions that might be included in the context of running that service. The first is things that I can attribute directly to that incremental website project. So Todd, you buy a website for me. I'm going to go and I'm going to buy a website template specifically for you. And I'm going to spin up a hosting instance specifically for you. And I'm going to maybe buy some plugin or some library to add some functionality to your website. And I can tie all of those costs directly back to you, and they're 100% incremental to that website project. In that case, that's a direct cost of delivery. Whereas I might have a Figma subscription, and I've got my ChatGPT subscription, and I've got my UX Pilot subscription. And that subscription isn't really going up or down whether I have 10 clients or I have 5 clients. It's just sort of a tool that I have in my tool belt that we're going to consider an indirect delivery cost. And we're going to take that into account in the second level of profitability, which I'll talk about next, which is what is typically thought of as gross margin, and we like to call delivery margin. And that's really when you're paying attention to, when I look at all of the revenue that we collected over a given time period from the services or products that we sold, and then I look at the entire cost of running the delivery function in the business, what is my margin there? And generally, we expect that margin to be anywhere from 10 to 20% lower than the direct margin on the product itself, because you have some of these shared delivery expenses. You're going to have maybe people in the business that have management functions, but are not working directly on production or directly on delivery. So in a service-based business, a good example of this would be like your creative director, where they spend like half their time actually in projects, but the other half of the time they're kind of coaching the team and doing professional development and doing one-on-ones, right? Their project managers, account managers tend to have a lot of time like that. And then the last piece is utilization. You might have in your team 40 hours a week per person, but they're only going to get 32 of those hours, actually productive working on client work. So all of that unutilized time, the holidays, the time off, it's a cost of running that function in the business, but you're not going to tie that directly to each unit of work. So there you're looking generally for a 50% or greater margin on the profit and loss statement. And again, courses, information products, software, you might want to see a much higher margin there, like a 70 or 80% margin on the P&L.
Okay, gotcha. So those fixed costs that are just a part of doing business are not what we're calculating into that first level, but anything that's just directly involved in delivering your service or product to the customer is what we're looking at. So if you have to hire, say, a graphic designer to do a logo or a website, for example, like we've got health coaches that a part of their program is running labs for their clients. And so that would be a cost in actually delivering the service to the client.
That's right. And if you were hiring those people on a freelance basis, right, it's often very easy to figure this out because it's like 100% of the time that you paid for, they were doing work and you can attribute it back to a specific project. If you have salaried people, it gets a little bit more complicated because you got to figure out, well, how many hours did they spend on each thing and attribute their direct cost based on what is their cost per hour multiplied by that time. And then any time that wasn't spent doing client work would be considered a shared delivery expense. And that would sort of represent the delta between, we made a 70% margin on this project, but as a business, we only landed at 50%. And the reason for that is maybe we weren't quite as busy as we could have been, or we have, all of these other sort of expenses that are indirect, but required to run this function of delivery.
Now, what about the cost of paid ads for traffic? If we're running Facebook, Google, YouTube ads, where does that factor into all this?
Excellent question. So now we get into the third set of expenses, which is overhead. Right. So there's costs to running the business. Those generally fall into three broad categories. The first is sales and marketing. You got to go out and acquire customers, and that often requires an investment of either time or money, often both. You have administration. So all the stuff that you got to do to run your business, you got your lawyers, your accountants, your admin software, maybe you have an assistant, maybe you have some other administrative costs that you got to take on. And then the last one, of course, is facilities. And a lot of people now don't really have offices and things like that. You might. So if you do, that's going to be factored into this. But even if you're having home office expenses, you have cell phones, you provide computers to your team, right? There's going to be some amount of cost related to putting a working environment around the people that work for you. So that is often going to make up anywhere from, especially in service businesses, 20 to 30% of a company's income. So when you think about that, we start with 100%. We're going to spend probably, let's call it 30 on direct delivery expenses. We're going to spend another 10 to 20 on indirect delivery expenses. And then we're going to spend another 20 to 30 on overhead. That's how you sort of end up at ideally 20 to 40% bottom line profit on all the income that's coming in. So that's why we're targeting that 70% plus direct margin when we sell something, because we got to account for all these other costs. And to your point earlier, some business models and some industries have higher customer acquisition costs because there's more competition. Those channels are more saturated. Different go-to-market motions are going to have different levels of, unit economics efficiency. So the long and short here is the higher the margin on the product that you sell, the more resources you have to then go and spend money to acquire a customer. So that's part of the reason that pricing for high margins can be really advantageous. And to your point, can help somebody get off the ground because it gives them the ability to go out and spend enough money to build a brand or build traffic. I
like the way that you break that down to those specific numbers and goals. My wife and I went with this just not even knowing, and I don't even know right now if you were to ask us, what are the direct costs and indirect, I don't even know that we could say. We should probably figure that out. All I know is that we're profitable, and we're profitable enough that we're comfortable in life, but I know that if we want to grow, we need to figure these things out. If somebody's first starting out and they're not even sure what these costs are going to be, do you have a strategy for people to kind of have a starting point for what their pricing should be?
100%. I think this is generally pretty straightforward in product businesses where you have costs of inputs and then you have the price that you're selling things for. That's simple math. What does it cost me to buy the inputs? How many of those do I need for one unit? What am I going to sell the unit for? You have your margin. Where it gets a little bit fuzzier is when you're just spending your time to deliver part or all of the service. So this is going to be common, of course, in any kind of service-based business model, digital agencies, marketing agencies, et cetera. It's also true about coaching and in some cases, education products, especially if you're bundling that education product with maybe it's live coaching calls or one-on-one consultation or services, right? We see those combinations very often. In that case, as the owner, I think the mistake that a lot of people make is they go, well, my time's free. I'm not having to pay anybody for it. So they don't really consider their time. The right way to think about that would be to write down, I generally encourage you to keep this to 3 to 5 sort of hats that you wear in order to deliver the service. So let's imagine we're selling websites. I'm starting out. I don't have a team. It's just me. I'm doing all the things. Well, what are the hats that I wear when I sell a website to a client from beginning to end? Well, Sometimes I'm the strategy director. Okay. Sometimes I'm the project manager. Sometimes I'm the designer. Sometimes I'm the developer. Sometimes I'm the copywriter. So those are my buckets. And then what I would do is think about, if I was to go hire someone else to do this work, what would it cost me? And I would be conservative in that estimate, right? So maybe you could find somebody for $30 an hour, but like probably it's going to be closer to 50. Use the 50 number. That's just a general good practice. Give yourself a little bit of room. And then add up all the time that you think it's going to take to get that thing done. Again, be conservative. If it's between 2 and 5 hours, like maybe aim for 4, and add up the total cost of hours multiplied by rate. That'll give you a sense of the delivery cost related to time. And the reason this is so important is because what will hopefully happen is at some point, you'll get to a place where you're like, I have so many customers, I can't do this all by myself anymore. I need to hire people. Right? That's what we're all trying to get to. If you haven't done this exercise, there's a good chance you're going to have 2 problems to solve at that point. Problem number 1 is I can't afford to pay other people to do this for me. Or if I start paying people to do this for me, I'm not going to have enough cash to pay for the other things I need to pay for in the business, like acquiring customers, et cetera. So you sort of get stuck in this place where the first thing you have to do is raise your prices. And then in some cases, wait for those pricing increases to flow all the way through your customer base so you actually have improved cash flow. Then you need to go do the second thing, which is also hard, which is find good people, hire them, train them, onboard them, keep them around, make sure the quality is good, right? That's hard enough already. So let's just take the pricing problem off the table today by pricing with what it's going to cost you in the future in mind right now.
That whole dynamic of hiring other people and the cost of that in order to scale, I think is a huge problem that people run into at some point, that when you hit it, is very disruptive to your business to try to fix that problem if and when you run into it. When you're looking at someone who's trying to build an agency business or a coaching business or something like that, I know that a lot of times when we're talking to people and they think about how much money they want to make and how many clients they can bring on, if they're doing, say, one-on-one coaching, or if they're doing agency work and they're looking at just the time that they spend with their clients, a lot of times what people tend to ignore is the time it takes to acquire the customer as well. And they don't figure that into their schedule. So for example, when we're looking at doing sales calls, we know that we probably need to do somewhere between 3 and 5 sales calls to acquire one client. But a lot of people aren't figuring in the time to do the sales calls into their schedule. And they think that, okay, I can just fill up my calendar full of clients, but then you have no time for the sales calls, right? Does that factor into any of this at all? The time to do the sales part of your business?
100%. You're touching now on, we're sort of delving out of pricing into just the service-based business model in general. And I'm happy to go down that rabbit hole. Before we do, I want to just button up a couple of things on pricing if we could. So number 1, I want to just come back to the formula. So if there's nothing else that you take away from today's episode, let it be that direct delivery margin is sort of the gold standard in pricing. You want that number to be as high as possible, but if you sell services, try to aim for at least 70%. The formula to arrive at a minimum price or a minimum hourly rate, if you happen to be selling things based on time and materials, which in some cases makes a lot of sense, is you take your cost to deliver and you divide it by 1 minus your margin target. So just to give you a simple example of this, if I have a $1,000 cost to deliver and I want to have a 70% margin, then I would divide $1,000 by 0.3, which is 1 minus 70%. And that would give me about a $3,000 minimum price, right? That's what I would have to charge for this thing. And if you have pass-through expenses, so let's say, for example, media spend, like you're going to sell a PPC ad campaign to a client and they're going to give you the $5,000 a month to give to Google and it's going to pass through you, then you want to make sure you add that on top. So now you need to charge the client at least $8,000 a month. $3,000 for your time, $5,000 for the ads, and then hopefully you make the right margin on that product. And the same thing can apply to an hourly rate. If you know that the average cost per hour of the people doing the work is going to be, $100, then you need to charge at least $300 an hour in that instance. So it works both ways for time units or for total projects. And that time unit could be an hour, a day, a week, a month, whatever time unit you want to sell to the client. So that's the pricing formula. With that, we can move on to a very good question that you're asking, which is, how do you consider time and capacity in this service-based business model? It's an excellent question. So the big idea there is, the way that we do this with clients, and it's something that everybody listening here can do. And we actually have some free tools available that you can use to do this on your own if you're listening. So I'll make sure, Todd, if you want to include those in the show notes, I can send the link over after the recording. But we build what's called a model of the firm. And it's really actually quite simple when you think about it. We build a spreadsheet, and in that spreadsheet, we have a list of people. And each person, you're going to write down how much they get paid. And then you're going to write down how many hours a week they work in a normal week. For most people, that's 40. Unless you're in Europe, then it might be 37 or 35. And then you're going to write down, in an ideal, realistic context, where would you spend your time across delivery management, sales and marketing, and administration. And the way I want you to think about this is, if we had unlimited clients asking us to work with them, what would my week look like in that context? Knowing that you have other things that you need to do to keep the business running, and people on your team, even if you have a designer on your team that does a lot of design for the team, but you tell them, hey, your responsibility is to keep our Instagram account up to date. Well, what that should mean is that no matter how many clients there are, they still need to keep enough time blocked out to keep the Instagram up to date, right? So that's what we want to enter into that spreadsheet. And from there, we can start to calculate on a weekly basis, how much time is actually available to sell to clients? How much time can we actually spend doing client work? And then if we have an understanding of our pricing model, we should be able to then translate that into how much revenue can we realistically earn in a given time period. And if we have an understanding of what we think our costs are going to look like in terms of payroll, in terms of overhead, then we should also be able to get a sense of, is this business going to be profitable? Or is it going to be profitable enough for me to achieve my financial goals? So this is the first thing that we do with every client that we work with. And the reason for that is sometimes they're struggling with profitability, and they think it's because, they're not working hard enough. They're not good enough at managing their projects. They're not efficient enough at doing the work. And often what we'll uncover is, well, actually, you've designed your business to fail and you just didn't know it, right? The math just doesn't add up. We need to fix that, because there's no amount of hard work that's going to change a structural component in your business that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that's the first thing that you work on, because that's the same thing with us. That's the first thing we'll look at. Is we'll ask our clients, what is your current pricing? What are your offers? And then we'll look at, what is your monthly revenue goal? And based on that, we can typically determine whether that's realistic or not. Sometimes we'll have people come in and they've got a one-on-one coaching program that they're selling for $1,500, and they want to generate at some point 6 figures a month. And you do the math and it's like, well, right away, that you just don't have enough hours in a day to do that. So yeah, it's a matter of figuring out profitability and time to deliver and all that stuff. And there's a lot that goes into that. One of the things that we'll often discuss is how you can tell when it's time to raise your prices. Do you ever discuss that with your clients, or how do you determine if or when you can raise your prices?
So, and there's kind of two components to this. There's strategic and objective. So from a strategic side, one of the best things I've ever heard on this is actually from a good friend of mine, Dan. He said, if 40% of people don't get weak in the knees and uncomfortable when you tell them your price, it's not high enough. So I've always seen that as actually being like a pretty good heuristic for, am I charging enough? And of course, that's a moving target, because what I found is, the longer I've been in business with Parakeeto, the more content we've created, the more podcasts like this I've done, the more stages I've spoken on, the higher the expectation of how expensive we're going to be to work with gets, right? So I just recently got into this group with a bunch of other consultants in our space. And at that time, we didn't have our pricing on the website. And I asked them, like, hey, how much do you think it costs to work with us? And everybody was guessing like 3 times more than it actually costs to work with us. And I was like, that's interesting. Maybe it's time for us to raise our prices, right? So that's part one, right? Is just, how are people perceiving your pricing? And are you creating just enough discomfort? That's how you know you're really pushing up against psychologically sort of where the market will bear in terms of your pricing. The objective side of that is, do you have the right margins in your business, right? So are you achieving at least that 70% margin? And if you're not achieving at least that 70% margin, then of course, the quickest way to improve that is to raise your pricing. But if you are already losing a lot of deals, more than 40% of opportunities due to pricing objections, then you pretty much have to look at the efficiency side of that and say, can we get this done for less money or in less time? And then you have to think about, what is the best time to do this in terms of where the business is. And the best time to raise your prices is when you are so busy that you're like, we might have to hire more people if we get more clients. And this is especially true if you have a recurring business model. Because if you think about this, like, if you have a team of people and they have a certain amount of capacity, let's call it 1,000 hours of capacity per month, and you're only using 500 of those hours to earn revenue, then it honestly doesn't matter what your price is. You're paying every day, every minute of every day for capacity that's essentially not getting monetized. So selling anything for any amount of time is better than literally losing money on excess capacity that's not being utilized. Now, in that case, what I generally recommend to a client working with us is, you should let go of some people. You should right size the amount of capacity you have to the amount of work you have coming in. Create the context then where if a client comes to you and buys your service at a higher price, now you have two good things going on. Number one, you have a client coming in at a higher price, but instead of throwing that on top of the pile and then going and hiring more people and having your costs incrementally increase, what you should do in that instance is go to your worst client that's the least profitable and say, hey, Todd, I really appreciate, how long you've been working with us. We've really loved it. Your needs have changed over time. I'm concerned that we can't continue to support you in the way that you expect at the current scope of work. I think it's time for us to have a conversation about how to readjust our engagement to make sure it's meeting your goals going forward. Here's what it would need to look like. And if Todd says, hey man, that's I don't want to pay that. You go, no problem, Todd. It's been a real pleasure. Let me connect you to someone else that's a better fit. And now you increase your revenue, increase your profit, but there's been no change in your cost basis. We once worked with a client that tripled their business in 18 months, and they were making less money than when they were a third of the size. This was the reason why. They had 10-year-old clients that they were literally losing money on every month. And when we ran an analysis on their business, we found that they could grow by, I think it was like 100% year over year and increase their profit by 500% if they just stopped hiring people and started replacing their worst clients with the new ones that they were selling at much higher prices. And inevitably what happened is a lot of their old clients agreed to the new pricing. So they were able to do that twice as fast as if they actually had to replace all the clients. So that's, I think, a really important thing to think of is if you want to raise your prices, the best possible time to do that is when you don't even really want the new work because you're so busy, because then you have leverage.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That I hadn't thought about that, about replacing the old clients with the new ones with a higher price. That kind of brings me to another question about pricing model, because you kind of mentioned a recurring subscription. I know a lot of the people that we work with, they're doing coaching programs, and it's just like a one-time cost for like a 6-month coaching program. Do you find that there are ways to maybe take a program like that and add a recurring subscription on the end of that or something? Or are there ways to maximize the profitability with something like that? Or even on the opposite end of that, if you've got a recurring subscription model, are there ways to maybe do like an onboarding cost or like a one-time upfront cost that maybe boosts profitability on the front end? Like, are there ways to work with your pricing where you can kind of hit it on both ends?
100%. There's a couple of different vectors I want to talk through this at. One is cash flow, which is not actually the same as profitability. They're related, but they're not intrinsically linked. But cash flow becomes incredibly important when you're thinking about funding growth, right? In some cases, even if your profitability is not improving, if you can improve cash flow, you can grow a lot faster because so much of growth comes down to your cash conversion cycle. So just to like draw out a simple example of this is if it costs me $1,000 to get a client and I want to add 10 clients a month, then the amount of money I need to tie up in advertising at any given moment comes down to how many months it takes me to make $1,000 back from my clients after I consider my contribution margin. Very importantly, it's not just how long does it take me to get paid $1,000. It's how much time does it take me to gain $1,000 in contribution margin or profit from those clients. So if it takes me 6 months, then I need to take $1,000 multiplied by 10. So that's $10,000 a month to get 10 new clients, multiplied by 6 months or $60,000. That's what I need to spend before I start making any money back. So if I don't have $60,000 worth of cash, or if I don't have $60,000 worth of debt or investor money available to me, then I cannot grow that fast. However, if I can take that cash conversion cycle and cut it down to 1 month, then I only need $10,000 tied up in marketing at any given moment. So I need significantly less cash. There's significantly less risk. And in a perfect world, this is like, I know Alex Hormozi is a really big proponent of this. If you can get to a negative cash conversion cycle, meaning I don't need to tie any money up in marketing every month because I'm actually making money the second I get a new client, because what they pay me is more than what it costs me to acquire them, then I can theoretically grow infinitely fast. Of course, what we start to run into there is saturation and, how much money can I spend before the unit economics get crappy. But theoretically, it's like I'm incentivized in that moment to spend as much money as I can get my hands on as quickly as possible. So that's the cash flow side of things. So to your point, if you can do little things like having an implementation fee, having people pay for several months up front, right? This is why I actually kind of like here's a flat fee for 6 months of coaching, as opposed to here's the monthly cost of coaching that you pay every month, because I get more cash up front. That all helps my cash conversion cycle. Now, the flip side of that is the profitability side. And I think this becomes really important in services in terms of pricing model when we think about risk. one of the big challenges that I hear over and over again from people that sell services is we don't know how long it's going to take us to do this. We don't know how much it's going to cost. Or sometimes we think it's going to cost this much, and then the client asks us for a million extra things, or something goes wrong, or we screw something up. And then all of a sudden we're spending 10 times more money and time on this thing than we thought we were going to when we lose our shirts, right? So how do we consider risk, not just value, but risk in the pricing engagement? And how I generally think about this is as a quadrant. So if you think about, you have a vertical line. On that line, we want to have high value at the top, low value at the bottom. So that's the first question we want to ask ourselves is, how valuable is this to the client? And generally the way we want to think about that is, how many other options do they have to solve this problem? And how significant is this problem to them? Was it costing them to have this problem persist in their business? So for example, if I sell graphic design services, there's about 100,000 alternatives to me out there. That's my positioning, right? Just being real, I might be really good at it, but there's probably 10,000 really good designers out there. So from an alternatives perspective, I'm sort of pushing myself into a low value part of the quadrant, just because there's like a ton of other options that this company could choose from if the way I'm presenting myself to them is, I'm a graphic designer. So if you want to know what else is out there, just go type graphic design services into Google and spend the rest of your life sorting through all of your options. However, if I was to say, hey Todd, I help digital marketing agencies visually communicate complex marketing funnels using design, well, I'm still selling you graphic design services, but now you might have a couple dozen people that could say, oh, we're really experts. And if that happens to be your problem, then you now have fewer things to compare me to. So that's going to help me move up the value scale. Then the other side of that is, well, what's at stake for you? If you have one sales call every month that you could close or not close, and that sales call is worth, I don't know, $10,000, then if I could help you increase your close rate by 10%, that's really only worth $1,000 a month to you. But if you had 100 sales calls and they were worth $100,000 and I could help you increase your conversion rate by 10%, then it's worth orders of magnitude more. So you have to consider relative scale, relative value. So that helps you understand, are we selling a high value service in this context, or are we selling a low value service? And the second question we need to ask ourselves is, what's the risk here? And risk really comes down to, how well can we predict how much time and money we're going to have to spend to get this thing done? So low risk services would be things that are highly productized, the scope is fairly fixed, and we're very good at predicting what it's going to cost us. We've done it a million times. Generally, I would define that as being, you can consistently get to within 10 or 20% of the estimated budget, plus or minus. And the ideal scenario there is you're coming in under budget more often than you're going over budget, right? You're placing that bet and you're winning on that bet more times than you're losing on that bet. That would be considered low risk work. And the other side of that spectrum is, you can't do that, either because the scope's not that clear, or because the process is really not that clear, or maybe the client doesn't even know what they want, or maybe there's just inherent risk in the thing that you're solving. Like, it's just hard stuff. It's novel engineering. You're building new things that have never been built before. There's all kinds of examples of this, and really technical services like engineering, software development, like true UX design, that stuff sometimes is just risky. Like you can't predict what it's going to take to get something done going into it. And also, the bigger the organization, often the more risk there is in the engagement. Just because you have more stakeholders, those stakeholders are likely to change. The priorities of the organization are likely to change. Like, if you were to go build a piece of software for a Fortune 100 company, there's a really good chance it's going to take 3 years, and half the people that you started working with on the project are not going to be the same people that you're working on that project with a year and a half into it, right? There's going to be turnover. There's going to be all these things. So that's the high risk side of the spectrum. We can't predict this. So at a high level, how do we think about pricing in those two contexts? Well, one thing that's true all the time is we want to make sure we're hitting our margin. So whatever our pricing model is, are we getting to that 70% plus? On the high risk side of things, this is where it makes sense to sell time. That I know we've all heard, in podcasts and on our Instagram and in our LinkedIn feed, like, you should never sell time. You might as well just be faxing proposals to your clients if you're selling time. You can never scale a business that way. And if that was true, then all the biggest consulting firms in the world would not still be billing on time. But guess what? There's literally multi-billion-dollar companies all over the world that still do this. So it's not that it doesn't work. It's just that it's unpopular among these influencers. But objectively, if you can make a 70% margin on a unit of time, you can run a very profitable business. So on the high risk side, if it's high risk, low value, this is where hours actually makes a lot of sense, because generally, if it's low value work, the cost of labor is going to be fairly low. Therefore, your hourly rate to make a good margin doesn't have to be that high, and it creates a great perception of value. And then the game there is, If it takes more time or less time, as long as you get paid for that time, you're making your margin. And if you can make your labor as elastic, then you're great. You're making a good margin, and you just basically need to keep your team utilized, make sure you're not doing stuff for free and spending time that you're not getting paid for. As you move up scale to higher value increments, then we want to start to abstract time. And we can generally abstract time across two vectors. The first is the time unit. So instead of selling hours, maybe I'm selling days, weeks, biweekly sprints, months, right? So the broader the time horizon, the more I can generally charge for it. And I can also still benefit from some efficiency. So if I can get a week's worth of work done in 4 days, then I can still get paid for a whole week, but I've been more efficient. So I can start to capitalize on the higher value nature of that work. The second thing that we might want to abstract across is team. So instead of saying this developer is this much per week, we might say, hey, Todd, my cross-functional digital marketing visualization team, that's not a great example. My cross-functional, I don't know, software development team is this much per 2-week sprints, 20 grand per 2-week sprint. And the project that you've proposed here, I think is going to be anywhere from 30 to 40 sprints worth of work based on the current backlog. And as things change and we learn things and you add new features, we'll just keep adding those to the backlog and just make sure that we're always working on the most important thing. And then it doesn't matter if it takes twice as long to get that thing done, because I'm getting paid per 2-week sprint. As long as I'm delivering value, I'm good and my margins are fixed. So I share risk with the client when we sell time. And when we move to the high value, low risk stuff, that's where value-based pricing makes a lot of sense, where it's like, hey, Todd, tell me about your website. How many clients do you get every month? What would a small conversion rate improvement in your website mean for you? Does it make sense to invest 10% of that upside to get this done? And on the low risk, low value, that's where productized and flat rate services make a lot of sense. Where again, I can create the perception of value for you, but I can make that work by consistently being efficient and coming in under my estimated time to get that thing done and increase my hourly rate as a result. So hopefully that quadrant sort of helps people determine what is the right pricing model for a given scenario. And that works both for one time and recurring, right? Those concepts apply to both. And the thing I would say on one time versus recurring is what is actually congruent to the delivery of value for that client. I think one of the things that we've got a lot of fatigue around is everything being turned into a subscription. It's everything as a service, cat food as a service, everything, right? And I get it. Recurring revenue is super sexy. But if as a customer, I can't connect the dots between paying for this on a monthly basis and a continual delivery of value, then it's just going to feel icky to me and I'm going to want to cancel it. So don't try to force, recurring revenue, because reoccurring revenue where you get, a $6,000 payment for 6 months, but then people tend to re-up every 6 months. That's just as good. And to your point earlier, you can pull cash forward, which can actually allow you to outcompete your competitors in terms of being able to fund growth. So that was a very long monologue on pricing, but hopefully it was insightful in some way.
Yeah. No, I love it. I think those are some amazing insights and a lot of stuff that I haven't even heard before. And I love the objectivity of it all, but there's still a little bit of an art to it. So you mentioned you had some freebies that are probably going to help some people out. I'm sure people at this point are very interested in what those are, because I'm sure they're going to need some help with this.
Yeah. Absolutely. So number one, we have a free toolkit. It's called the Agency Profit Toolkit that you can grab on our website at parakeeto.com/toolkit. And that's packed with a bunch of training videos, free tools, cheat sheets to help you implement a lot of things that I talked about today. And there's even, if you get access to that, you'll be able to sign up for a 3-month trial of a piece of software that allows you to build a model of your firm, which is just like what I described earlier, where you can put your team in, how much time they work, and get an understanding of, is my business set up to be profitable? How much of my time is actually meant to be spent on client work? Those kinds of things, and simulate how changes to that impact your profitability. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'll include there is a link to a podcast episode where I go even deeper on the pricing model quadrant. And there's a video accompanying that where I draw that model out and go into a little bit more detail on the pricing side. So if anybody wants to go back and dig deep into that and get some visuals, I'll make sure that there's a link to that as well. And then the third thing is a little calculator on our website that helps you calculate your perfect price just based on the formulas I talked about today.
Awesome. Perfect. Yeah, we will absolutely grab those and put those in the show notes. So be sure to check those out. If people want to connect with you online, learn more about you and your company and what you do, where can they find you?
I would say the best place is LinkedIn. I'm fairly active there. I like to post helpful content, and I can't help myself but to get in my DMs and chat with people that have questions. So if you listen to this, you have questions, you want to chat about profitability, pricing, whatever, just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to talk to you there. If you want to learn more about what we do at Parakeeto, you can visit us at parakeeto.com. And we have a ton of content, calculators, free resources, and a podcast there as well. If you run a service-based business, hopefully that will be helpful for you.
Awesome. Perfect. Yeah. And we will have all the links for that in your socials and the show notes. So be sure and grab those. Thank you, Marcel, for being with us today. This is, like I said, incredibly insightful. I love this episode. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your knowledge with our audience.
You've been listening to the Digital Trailblazer podcast. For show notes and information about today's guest, head to digitaltrailblazer.com. Now, if you love this episode, if you got some value, make sure you leave us a review and subscribe. And be sure to share this episode with anyone you know who could use help to build their business. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.